You break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the doctor puts you in front of an X-ray machine.
Yeah, standard procedure.
Right. And the image comes back, and there's this, I don't know, this comforting, almost beautiful precision to it.
It's definitive.
Exactly. You see a jagged white line across the humerus, and the doctor just points to it and says, breaking.
Right. It's a binary state.
Yeah.
Broken or not broken.
It's a clean, observable fact. And I think as humans, we're just desperate for that kind of visibility.
Oh, absolutely. We want things perfectly categorized, especially when we're talking about health and capability.
Right. But the moment you take that diagnostic expectation, that desire for a clean binary X-ray, and you point it at the sociological concept of what is quote-unquote normal versus what is abnormal, the machine just completely shatters.
It breaks down completely because we're no longer looking at a biological reality at that point.
No. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely fabricated.
Yeah, it ceases to be medicine or even statistics. It immediately becomes this vast, invisible philosophical architecture.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The moment you attempt to mathematically or biologically define what normal is, you are literally laying the bricks for a political worldview.
And mapping out that invisible architecture is our entire mission today.
It's a big one.
It's massive. We are going to attempt what our source material basically describes as a dimensionality-reducing deconstruction of human cognitive structures.
Which is a mouthful, but we're going to break it down.
We really are. We're looking at how society defines the baseline of human existence and, what it historically does to people who fall outside of that baseline.
And we have a massive stack of sources to get through for this.
We really do. Crossing from statistical mathematics all the way to evolutionary biology.
Yeah, we're diving deep into standpoint epistemology and ultimately landing on some of the absolute darkest historical applications of biopolitics.
It's a sweeping academic and historical scroll, really.
It touches on the deepest anxieties of human civilization, specifically our terror of the unknown and our obsession with control.
But before we take our first step into this, I do need to pause and establish a very firm framework for you, the listener.
Yes, this is an important disclaimer.
Because the texts we are synthesizing today examine the underlying logic of some incredibly extreme, real-world sociological concepts.
Very heavy topics.
Yeah. We are talking about the philosophies surrounding ableism, the historical justifications for eugenics, and the societal logic that leads to opposing the birth of individuals with cognitive deficits, such as Down syndrome.
Right.
So I want to be unequivocally clear right up front. Neither of us here is taking a stance on disability, reproduction, or the surrounding politics.
Exactly. We are strictly acting as your impartial guides through this material.
That's our job. We're here to map out the logical, historical, and cognitive arguments presented in these texts.
We are opening up the engine of these ideologies to see how the gears turn. We are not endorsing the machine itself.
That distinction is paramount. So keeping that in mind, let's crack open this logic.
Let's do it.
The sources present this remarkably simple mathematical metaphor, and this metaphor is going to serve as the anchor for our entire deep dive today.
It's the foundation of everything we're going to talk about.
Right. So I want you to visualize human ability, intelligence, physical capability, social conformity as a standard normal distribution.
Your classic symmetrical bell curve.
Exactly. The absolute center of that curve, the bulging middle where the vast majority of the population sits, is given the absolute value of 1.
Normal equals 1.
Normal equals 1.
It is a mathematical identity element. It becomes the baseline against which literally everything else in the equation is judged.
Okay, so following that algebraic logic, if you look at an individual who possesses what society perceives as a deficit, say, someone with Down syndrome, they are measured starting from that baseline of 1.
And they are defined entirely by what they lack.
Right. They're calculated as 1 minus n.
They're a fraction. Less than 1.
It's less than 1. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, imagine a super individual.
Okay.
Someone with a cognitive or evolutionary mutation that grants them abilities far transcending the normal human baseline.
Right.
Like a true generational genius.
Right. So mathematically, they are calculated as 1 plus n.
Greater than 1.
The model is deceptively clean, right?
Yeah.
1 is the default. 1 minus n is a deficit. 1 plus n is an overflow.
But here is the provocation that the text immediately drops on us. And I want you to hold this in your mind for the rest of the hour.
It's a big one.
A normal person, A 1 looks at a 1 minus n individual and feels pity or perhaps believes they're lesser, or in the darkest historical cases, believes they should not exist because they drag down the baseline.
Right.
But what happens when that 1 plus n super individual looks down at the 1? If a 1 plus n, operating on a level of cognitive architecture we cannot even fathom, looks at the average human, wouldn't the normal person suddenly look like the error?
That's the question.
Right. By the exact same logic, would the 1 plus n feel that the 1 should be eliminated for the good of a higher evolutionary baseline?
That single question acts as a thread that unravels the entire sweater.
It completely flips the perspective.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because it forces us to confront the fact that the 1 is not a universal constant. It exposes the foundation of this mathematical model as a colossal historical illusion.
And to understand how we fell for that illusion, we have to look at what the text calls the tyranny of statistics.
Yes.
The core assumption of modern society seems to be that simply because normal people occupy the absolute majority of the population, they inherently earn the right to dictate the baseline.
They essentially crown themselves the 1.
Exactly. But we need to deconstruct the bell curve itself to see the flaw here.
Right. We do. Because in the realm of pure statistics, the Gaussian distribution, the bell curve, is merely descriptive.
Descriptive, not prescriptive.
Right. It is a completely neutral mathematical tool used to observe how data points gather in nature.
Like measuring trees or something.
Exactly. If you measure the height of 1,000 oak trees, most will cluster around an average height in the middle, with a few extremely short ones and a few towering ones at the tails. It just describes what is.
But a profound danger emerges when human society takes this purely descriptive tool and weaponizes it.
It weaponizes it into a normative standard.
Meaning they turn a description of the present into a rule for how the future must be.
Precisely the leap. And the French philosopher Georges Canguilhem tackled this brilliantly in his work The Normal and the Pathological.
Well, I'm glad we're bringing them up.
Yeah, he analyzed how a statistical, which is, frankly, just a mathematical accident of the current generation, was slowly twisted by medical and sociological institutions into a moral and biological ideal.
So suddenly the average was no longer just the most common trait.
No, it became synonymous with healthy, correct, and righteous.
Because the majority occupies that central bulge, they possess the sheer numbers to control institutional power.
Exactly. They write the laws, they design the cities, they dictate the educational curriculum.
Therefore, setting the baseline to 1 isn't just a fun math exercise.
Not at all. It dictates that the entire physical, economic, and social architecture of the world is rigidly custom-tactailored for the 1.
I mean, I'm picturing the literal architecture of our daily lives right now.
Think about it.
The standardized height of tactile pavings for the blind. The assumption that an employee can maintain focus for a standardized 40-hour work week.
Yes.
Even the highly specific, rigid metrics of standardized testing in elementary schools. Everything is a mold built around the 1.
The 1 becomes a fortress. In mathematics, as we mentioned, 1 is the benchmark for multiplication and division.
Right.
So when society sets its own average as 1, any individual who is deemed 1 minus n is stripped of their unique standalone identity.
They're no longer viewed as a complete entity on their own terms.
No, they are defined entirely, exclusively by their deprivation. They are just a shadow cast by the 1.
Okay, I want to challenge that slightly, just playing devil's advocate for a second. Isn't that kind of standardization just the cost of doing business as a civilization?
How do you mean?
Well, take door frames. A builder standardizes a door frame at around 6 feet 8 inches. It's incredibly practical. You can't custom build every doorway on Earth for the specific height of the person walking through it. You'd never finish a building.
The builder's efficiency is undeniable.
Right.
But the problem isn't the doorway itself. The problem is when the logic of the doorway is applied to human worth.
Ah.
When a person is too tall for the door, we don't say the person is biologically invalid.
Right, they just have to duck.
Exactly. But when we apply this to cognitive or psychological standardization, society does exactly that. They declare the person invalid.
That distinction makes me think of the myth of the Procrustean bed from ancient Greece.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
For those listening who don't know it, Procrustes was a rogue blacksmith, a bandit who invited weary travelers into his home and offered them an iron bed for the night.
A generous host, supposedly.
Supposedly. But he had a rigid, psychopathic rule. The traveler had to fit the bed perfectly.
Perfectly.
If the traveler was too short, Procrustes would chain their arms and legs and literally stretch their joints until they fit the length of the iron frame.
Horrific.
And if they were too tall, he would amputate their feet or their legs until they matched the bed's exact dimensions.
So the iron bed is the absolute one.
Yes. And society, when it demands complete conformity to its statistical average, acts as the bandit.
That is perhaps the most devastatingly accurate analogy for the sociological systems we are discussing. Society demands conformity to the Procrustean bed of the one.
And it will stretch or amputate you to make you fit.
It will medicate, amputate, or marginalize anyone, whether 1 minus n or 1 plus n, who disrupts that perfect fit.
It's terrifying.
Let's trace how this abstract concept actually became a brutal historical reality by looking at the invention of the intelligence quotient, the IQ test.
Oh man, the ultimate attempt to assign a single, definitive numerical value to human cognition.
Indeed. Now, Alfred Binet created the first practical intelligence test in France in the early 20th century, and it is crucial to understand his original intent.
Because it wasn't malicious, right?
Yeah, not at all. Binet's goal was purely diagnostic and deeply compassionate.
He just wanted a tool to identify young students who were falling behind in the standardized Parisian school system.
Right, so that the state could provide them with targeted, specialized tutoring. He explicitly warned against using his test to measure innate, unchangeable intelligence.
But then the test crossed the Atlantic.
It did. It was imported to the United States and fell into the hands of eugenicists like Henry Goddard.
And Goddard completely inverted Binet's compassionate tool.
Completely. He transformed it into a rigid biological hierarchy. An IQ score of 100 became the absolute unyielding 1.
It became the iron bed.
Exactly.
And what were the consequences for the people who were placed on it and found wanting?
Catastrophic. If a person scored below that baseline, if they were mathematically classified as 1 minus n, they weren't offered tutoring. They were branded with official, clinical, legal classifications, words that we use as casual insults today. Moron, imbecile, idiot, were actually rigid, bureaucratic categories.
Wait, really? Those were official legal terms?
Yes.
Oh.
And falling into one of those categories stripped you of your fundamental human agency.
How so?
It determined whether you were allowed to immigrate through Ellis Island, whether you could legally marry, and in thousands of cases, whether you would be subjected to forced sterilization.
That is just a staggering escalation. From a classroom tutoring aid to a tool for determining existential validation and reproductive rights.
To truly grasp how a society allows that escalation, we have to look through the lens of the French philosopher Michel Foucault.
Biopolitics.
Yes. Foucault developed a theory of biopolitics, which is essential for understanding the modern world. He argued that if you look at sovereign power in the Middle Ages, think of a king,
Right.
power was primarily defined by the right to kill. The king could publicly execute you, or he could choose to let you live.
The power of the sword.
Exactly. But as we moved into the 18th and 19th centuries, the nature of power fundamentally shifted. It became biopolitics.
So power was no longer just the theatrical sword of the executioner.
No, it became the quiet, bureaucratic management of human life itself.
Managing the population through statistics, birth rates, public hygiene, censuses.
Foucault described it as the power to make live and let die. The state began mathematically managing who was encouraged to flourish and who was quietly allowed to fade away.
Which is chilling.
Establishing the normal state as an unyielding one is the ultimate manifestation of biopolitical control.
Because the state isn't just measuring the population, it's actively curating the biological makeup of its citizens based on this completely arbitrary, statistically derived baseline.
Right. And if we accept that our society operates as this massive biopolitical Procrustean bed rigorously designed for the one, it brings up a really thorny cognitive question.
What's that?
How does a person who perfectly fits the bed, the normal one, actually perceive the mind of someone who doesn't?
Oh, that's a great question. What is happening internally when the 1 encounters the 1 minus n or the 1 plus n?
To answer that, the source text introduces us to a framework called standpoint epistemology.
Standpoint epistemology.
It is essentially the study of how our specific social, biological, or physical position in the universe entirely dictates and limits what we are capable of knowing.
It's an exploration of our cognitive blind spots.
Exactly.
Let me try to translate that into a more mechanical, everyday analogy for you listening. Think about a PlayStation 5.
Okay, good analogy.
It's a highly advanced piece of hardware. And one of its features is downward compatibility.
Right.
If you put a game disc from the older PlayStation 4 into the PS5, it runs perfectly. The PS5 possesses the massive processing power required to simulate the older, less complex environment of the PS4.
Makes sense.
But if you try to reverse that, if you force a highly complex next-generation PS5 game into the older PS4 console, it doesn't just play a simpler version of the game. The hardware literally crashes.
It simply does not possess the architecture to process the information.
Exactly.
And that mechanical limitation perfectly mirrors the cognitive limitation the text outlines. When a normal individual, a 1, attempts to understand an individual with a perceived deficit, like Down syndrome, a 1-N, they are engaging in a form of downward compatibility.
Right.
But the text makes a profound observation here. The perspective of 1-N is entirely the invention of the normal person. It is not the perspective of the individual with Down syndrome.
Because to the person with Down syndrome, they are complete. They're their own one.
Exactly the point. The normal person holds up their own complex ruler, a ruler calibrated to a length of 1, and attempts to measure the 1-N.
So they're basically running a simulation in their own mind.
Yes, they engage in a thought experiment. What would my life be like if I lost my ability to process this specific type of math, or if I lost this specific social cue?
It's a step-down simulation based on their existing complex hardware.
Exactly. They can subjectively conceptualize 1-N through this downward compatibility. But, just like the older console trying to run the advanced game,
The normal person is physically and cognitively incapable of achieving upward compatibility.
because we simply lack the hardware to simulate an intelligence or a processing power that transcends our own.
We are locked in our own architecture.
Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason provides the ultimate philosophical grounding for this.
Let's unpack Kant a bit here.
So, Kant proposed a radical idea. He divided all of reality into two realms. The phenomenal realm is the world as we perceive it through our human senses.
Okay.
The noumenal realm is the thing in itself, the true objective reality of the universe, which Kant argued we can never ever access.
So if I look at a red apple, I am experiencing the phenomenal red apple.
Yes.
But my brain and my eyes are just interpreting light waves. The true noumenal apple doesn't have a color in the way I understand it.
Beautifully put. Kant argued that our minds are not blank slates. We are born with hardwired a priori categories, like our internal concepts of space, time, and causality.
And these categories act as an inescapable filter.
Exactly. We are trapped within our neurophysiological hardware. We cannot even hallucinate a sensory capacity or a logical dimension that we do not biologically possess.
That's wild.
Therefore, attempting to evaluate a 1+N superindividual using the cognitive apparatus of a 1 is like trying to use the visible light spectrum of the human eye to prove or disprove the existence of ultraviolet radiation.
You literally can't see the ultraviolet light, so your brain assumes the space is empty or that the light source is broken.
Precisely.
There is a classic 1884 science fiction novella that I think illustrates this perfectly. Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions by Edwin A. Abbott.
Oh, I love Flatland.
Right. In this book, the entire universe is a two-dimensional plane, like a sheet of paper.
Yep.
All the inhabitants are geometric shapes, squares, triangles. They only have length and width. They have no concept of up or down.
A purely 2D reality.
So the protagonist is a square. And one day, a three-dimensional sphere visits Flatland.
A classic intersection of dimensional limits.
Right. And because the square only possesses 2D cognitive hardware, it is entirely blind to the sphere's 3D nature.
They can't process it.
So when the sphere hovers above Flatland and speaks, the square hears a voice coming from nowhere.
Spooky.
And when the sphere actually passes through the 2D plane of Flatland, the square only sees the cross-section of the sphere. So the square observes a tiny point of light that miraculously expands into a massive circle and then shrinks back down to a point before vanishing.
Because it's moving through the plane.
Exactly. The square's brain cannot process 3D geometry, so it concludes that the sphere is a shape-shifting monster, a demon, or a hallucination. The one hardware completely crashes when confronted with the 1+N reality.
Flatland is an elegant spatial representation of this cognitive failure. We can apply this exact same limitation to pure logic and mathematics by looking at Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Now, I know Gödel shattered mathematics in the 1930s, but how do we apply his theorems sociologically?
Well, Gödel mathematically proved that any formal system of logic that is complex enough to do basic arithmetic will always contain propositions that are true, but that can absolutely never be proven from within the system itself.
The system is inherently incomplete.
Yes, it cannot validate its own edges. So if we map Gödel onto human society, imagine a social structure composed entirely of normal people, a closed system of ones.
Okay.
If a 1 plus n super intellect emerges within that society, the system of ones is completely incapable of internally verifying whether this individual is a visionary prophet or a dangerous lunatic.
Why?
Because the 1 plus n is operating on logical axioms, intuitive leaps, and connections that exist entirely outside the system's provable geometry.
Wow. The system of ones demands proof in a language the 1 plus n has already outgrown.
Exactly. And we run into this exact wall when we discuss artificial intelligence and the Turing test. Alan Turing designed his famous test to determine if a machine could exhibit intelligence indistinguishable from a human.
A judge passes notes to a machine and a human hidden in another room. If the judge can't tell which is the machine passes.
But think about the arrogance of that test.
How so?
It assumes that the highest form of intelligence looks exactly like human intelligence.
Ah, right.
If an AI system reaches a true 1 plus n state, a superintelligence that processes hyperdimensional data flows and multivariable logic trees, we can't fathom. Why would it bother conforming to our slow, linear, rigid dialogue trees?
You wouldn't.
To a human judge, the output of a 1 plus n AI might look like chaotic, nonsensical gibberish. We lack the cognitive scale to judge superintelligence. We only know how to test for a reflection of ourselves.
That leads to a really disturbing thought.
What's that?
If the one, the normal person, literally lacks the biological and logical hardware to comprehend the 1 plus n, what actually happens when they encounter each other in the real world?
It's usually a tragedy.
Right. If society is a Procrustean bed and a giant walks into the room, does society just immediately grab the saw and start cutting?
It does, and this phenomenon is what the source text categorizes as the disaster of confusion.
The disaster is confused.
Because from the limited vantage point of the normal 1 baseline, the super individual, the 1 plus n, and the deficient individual, the 1 minus n, look visually and behaviorally identical.
They are completely conflated in the public consciousness.
Exactly.
That rings so true when you look at cultural tropes. Think of the mad scientist mixing chemicals in a dark basement, or the tortured, erratic artist starving in a garret.
They're archetypes.
Because if you are standing dead center, right in the fat middle of the bell curve, any extreme deviation, whether it plummets to the left toward 1 minus n or skyrockets to the right toward 1 plus n, simply registers as unpredictable, chaotic nonconformity.
It all looks like a threat to the comfortable order.
Right.
What you are describing is a sociological application of the horseshoe theory.
Now, we normally hear about the horseshoe theory in political science, right? Where political extremes, if you go far enough left or far enough right, end up bending around and resembling each other in their authoritarian methods.
Yes, but applied to cognitive ability, it explains why the center is completely blind to the spectrum.
How does it blind them?
Because the one cannot comprehend the hyper-fast logical processing, the intense singular focus, or the multidimensional insights of the 1 plus n. So the one can only observe the surface-level behavioral side effects.
And what are those side effects?
Severe reclusiveness, an intense fanaticism about niche topics, total social friction, an absolute refusal to engage in the mundane rituals of small talk.
Right.
The one observes these traits and immediately attributes the genius of the 1 plus n to a crippling mental deficit. In the eyes of the mediocre center, the silhouette of a genius perfectly overlaps with the silhouette of a madman.
We have to ground this with some specific historical examples because the history of science and art is essentially a graveyard of this exact tragedy.
It really is.
The text points specifically to conditions like autism spectrum disorder and Asperger's, highlighting figures like Alan Turing and John Nash.
Turing and Nash are quintessential victims of the disaster of confusion.
Let's look at Turing first.
He is the father of theoretical computer science. He cracked the Nazi Enigma code, arguably shortening World War II by years and saving millions of lives.
And John Nash completely revolutionized game theory and partial differential equations.
Their minds were soaring in a 1 plus n stratosphere. But society, entirely entrenched in its rigid 1 baseline, judged them almost exclusively by their perceived deficits.
Because the standard of 1 mandates a very specific neurotypical rhythm for social interaction, a certain way of performing normalcy.
Exactly. Society focused heavily on their social friction, their eccentricities, their 1 minus n characteristics.
And in Turing's case, society actively punished him for it.
Brutally. Despite his unimaginable contributions, the British government prosecuted him for his homosexuality, which they viewed as an intolerable deviation from the baseline.
They chemically castrated him, driving him to suicide.
Society demanded they fit the one, and methodically broke them when they didn't.
I am reminded of the Cassandra complex here.
Oh, Greek mythology, yes.
Greek mythology is so perceptive about this stuff. Cassandra was a princess of Troy who was given the ultimate 1+N gift, the power of perfect prophecy. She could see the future.
But there was a catch.
Right. The god Apollo cursed her so that no one would ever believe her. When she tried to warn the Trojans about the wooden horse, when she frantically tried to explain the destruction that was coming, the Trojans, representing the baseline ones, couldn't process her multidimensional insight.
So what did they see?
They just saw a woman screaming in the streets. They saw 1-N. They lacked the hardware to process her truth, so they immediately pathologized her as insane.
It is the exact same mechanism of delayed recognition that we see in the arts, perhaps most famously with Vincent van Gogh.
Oh, absolutely.
During his lifetime, Van Gogh was an absolute pariah. The normal people around him, the art critics and the townspeople, viewed him simply as a volatile madman who could not hold a job and eventually mutilated his own ear.
Right. He was categorized entirely as a dysfunctional 1-N who failed to operate within society.
But then it took humanity's collective artistic cognitive system nearly a full century to upgrade.
To develop the frameworks necessary to understand expressionism, emotional color theory, and post-impressionism.
Yes. Only then did society retroactively crown him a 1+N genius. His internal reality was always 1+N, but the ones of his era were biologically and culturally restricted to processing him as a defective 1-N.
This everyday misunderstanding, this inability to differentiate between a leap forward and a step backward, is tragic when it ruins the life of an artist or a mathematician.
It is.
But the text pivots here to something exponentially darker.
This is where we get into the really heavy material.
Right. What happens when a state government, armed with police forces, legal frameworks, and vast resources, weaponizes this exact cognitive limitation? What happens when the fear of the abnormal becomes law?
That is when we cross into the surface layer of the ideologies the text aims to deconstruct. We enter the realm of ableism, social Darwinism, eugenics, and the horrific concept of life unworthy of life.
Now, the text calls these historical atrocities the surface manifestation, which implies there's a deeper root.
There is.
But we have to fully understand the surface before we can dig deeper. And the surface is essentially a history of legalized slaughter.
The foundational value system driving the surface layer is ableism, backed by the pseudoscientific worldview of social Darwinism. And to understand how intelligent, educated societies fell for this, we must deconstruct a massive, lethal philosophical error known as the naturalistic fallacy.
This is David Hume's concept, right?
Yeah.
The philosophical trap of looking at what is and forcefully translating it into what ought to be.
Exactly. Let's look at Charles Darwin for a second. His theory of evolution by natural selection is purely descriptive science.
Right. It outlines the mechanics of what is.
In nature, organisms that are better adapted to their specific environment tend to survive longer and produce more offspring. It describes a blind mechanical process of survival.
But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sociologists and philosophers like Herbert Spencer completely hijacked this biological observation.
They did. They smuggled the is across the border and turned it into a moral ought.
So social Darwinism argued that if nature favors the strong, then the strong deserve to rule.
And crucially, that the weak ought to be eliminated to ensure the hygiene and progress of the human species. They turned a biological observation about finches into a moral mandate to purify human bloodlines.
They literally took the cruelty of the food chain and tried to pass it off as human ethics.
And this philosophical shift requires a specific legal mechanism to function. The philosopher Giorgio Agamben coined a term that perfectly describes the status of the 1-N individual under this regime. Homo sacer, or bare life.
Bare life, what does that mean in practice?
Well, Agamben explored how ancient Roman law and modern sovereign power operate by stripping a human being of their political and social identity.
Right.
Through the lens of eugenics, an individual deemed 1-N, whether due to cognitive disability, physical deformity, or mental illness, is stripped of their citizenship, their legal protections, their very personhood.
They are reduced to pure biological flesh.
Bare life. Exactly. And the terrifying trick of sovereign power is that once a person is reduced to bare life, the state can kill them without it legally constituting murder.
They're simply erased from the ledger, like removing a defective part from a machine.
Yes.
And we cannot pretend this is ancient history or something that only happens in totalitarian dictatorships.
Yes.
This logic was enthusiastically embraced by modern constitutional democracies.
Very much so.
We talked about Henry Goddard weaponizing the IQ test earlier. That weaponization reached the absolute highest courts in the United States. We have to discuss the chilling 1927 U.S. Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell.
Buck v. Bell is a watershed moment. It is the moment the Procrustean bed was welded into the framework of American constitutional law.
Can you walk us through the case?
The case centered on Carrie Buck, a young woman who had been committed to a state feeble-minded institution in Virginia. She had been raped by a family member of her foster parents, became pregnant, and was institutionalized to hide the scandal.
Horrific on its own.
But the state of Virginia wanted to forcibly sterilize her, arguing that Carrie, her mother, and her newborn infant daughter were all biologically feeble-minded.
They argued they were hereditary 1-Ns who threatened the genetic stock of the nation.
Right. The case ascended all the way to the Supreme Court to determine if the state had the constitutional right to surgically sterilize a citizen against her will.
And the ruling was an 8-1 decision validating the forced sterilization. The majority opinion was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who's generally revered as a giant of American jurisprudence. But the words he wrote in that opinion constitute one of the most chilling paragraphs in legal history.
You really do.
He wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." And then he finished with, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That is the absolute unyielding voice of the one, wielding the power of the state to declare the 1-N as bare life. It is the ultimate biopolitical decree.
And this wasn't just rhetoric.
No, not at all. That single Supreme Court ruling directly legitimized and turbocharged the forced sterilization of approximately 60,000 Americans in the decades that followed.
50,000 people.
It was done under the banner of science, public health, and societal optimization. It was a systematic, state-sponsored eradication of the 1-N from the future gene pool.
And that American legal precedent, that specific justification of public hygiene, provided a direct blueprint for the greatest atrocity of the 20th century.
It did.
The text explicitly links this American logic to Nazi Germany and the Action T4 program. There is a historical misconception we really need to clear up here. When those people think of the Holocaust, they immediately think of the extermination camps, Auschwitz, and the genocide of the Jewish populations.
Right.
But the industrialization of mass murder, the concept of life unworthy of life, or Lebenswert Leben, did not begin there.
It did not. The blueprint for the gas chambers was drafted in the hospitals.
Explain that.
Action T4 was the Nazi state's involuntary euthanasia program, operating years before the final solution was fully implemented. Its very first targets were not political or ethnic minorities, they were German citizens.
Specifically the physically disabled, psychiatric patients, the terminally ill, and infants born with conditions like Down syndrome.
The state established tribunals determining the value of life.
Tribunals determining the value of life. Just the phrase is sickening.
And what makes Action T4 so profoundly terrifying is the sheer banality of its execution. These tribunals were not staffed by frothing sadists. They were staffed by respected doctors, psychiatrists, and bureaucratic accountants.
They operated using economic ledgers.
They would literally calculate how many potatoes, how many hospital beds, and how many medical resources a Down syndrome infant or schizophrenic patient would consume over their lifetime.
Oh, wow.
And then they compared that cost to the individual's projected economic output. And based purely on that utility ledger, they decided to purge the 1-N.
They murdered them, often using carbon monoxide gas in specially designed hospital rooms, simply to save money and resources for the centralized state machine.
They equated human value entirely with economic efficiency toward the one baseline.
Let me just pause here. I want you listening to really sit with the gravity of this. 60,000 Americans surgically sterilized because a court deemed them manifestly unfit. German doctors, men of science, calculating the daily caloric intake of a disabled infant to justify murdering them in a gas chamber to balance a budget.
It represents the absolute darkest depth of modern biopolitics.
But this is where our source text pulls the rug out from under us.
It does.
The text argues that everything we just laid out, The ableism, the social Darwinism, Buck v. Bell, the horror of Action T4, all of that is just the surface layer,
It's merely the symptom of a deeper disease.
which is mind-blowing. How can a machine that murders infants be just the surface? What could possibly be the actual root cause?
To unearth the root cause, we must leave the realm of history and plunge deep into the philosophy of language and epistemology. This brings us to the second layer of the text's analysis.
Okay, let's go.
The foundation of this entire bloody ideological edifice rests on a single, unvoiced, and completely flawed presupposition. The assumption is that normal equals the objective standard, which equals 1.
Right.
But the text methodically dismantles this. The concept of 1 is not an objective fact of the universe. It is a linguistic illusion.
Okay, I'm going to need you to build a bridge for me here, because this is where the philosophy gets incredibly dense.
It does, yeah.
The text states that 1 is not an objective stance. It is an indexical word. Can you break down what an indexical is in the philosophy of language and why it shatters this whole ideology?
Absolutely. In linguistics and philosophy, an indexical is a word whose meaning is not fixed. Its meaning depends entirely on the context in which it is spoken.
Context is everything.
Specifically, it depends on who is speaking, where they are, and when they are speaking. The classic examples of indexicals are words like I, here, now, or tomorrow.
Okay, give me an example of how that works.
Let's look at the word here. If I am standing in the middle of Times Square in New York and I say I am here, that statement is demonstrably true for me.
Right.
But my here is not the center of the universe. If
Yeah.
you are standing in the middle of a crosswalk in Tokyo and you say I am here, your statement is also entirely true.
So the meaning of here shifts dynamically depending on the anchor point of the observer.
Exactly. So here is relative. It describes a relationship to the speaker, not an absolute fixed coordinate in space.
So how does this tie back to the 1?
The foundational error of eugenics, ableism, and all forms of extreme societal standardization is taking a relative statistical variable, the average cognitive or physical ability of the current human population, and treating it as if it were an absolute eternal moral constant.
Ah, I see.
The philosopher Gilbert Ryle called this a category mistake.
A category mistake. I think Ryle used the example of a visitor taking a tour of Oxford University, right?
Yes, that's the classic one.
The guy shows the visitor the colleges, the massive libraries, the administrative offices, and the scientific laboratories. And at the end of the tour, the visitor looks around and asks, okay, but where's the university?
Right. The visitor has made a category mistake.
They assume the university is another physical building.
Yeah.
Rather than the abstract concept that encompasses all the buildings together. They're looking for something in the wrong category of reality.
That is the perfect illustration. Society makes the exact same error with the concept of normal. Society has taken a concept that clearly belongs in the category of relative, temporary statistical descriptions and forcefully jammed it into the category of absolute, objective moral truths. The entire underlying tone of eugenics is mistaking one's own self-anchored accidental center for the divine origin point of the universe.
Mistaking an accidental center for the origin of the universe. That phrase gives me massive geographical déjà vu.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it immediately makes me think of the Mercator projection, the traditional world map most of us grew up looking at in classrooms.
Oh, that's a brilliant connection.
If you look at a Mercator map created centuries ago by European cartographers, Europe is placed dead center. And because of the mathematical distortion required to flatten a 3D globe onto a 2D cylinder, the landmasses near the poles are wildly exaggerated, while the landmasses near the equator are shrunk.
Right.
So on this map, Greenland looks roughly the same size as the entire continent of Africa. In reality, Africa is about 14 times larger than Greenland. The mapmaker placed themselves at the absolute center of the page and literally distorted the geographical reality of the entire planet to fit their perspective.
Yeah.
Is the perfect visual metaphor for treating your accidental location as the objective baseline.
That spatial analogy maps perfectly onto the cognitive distortion we were discussing. And intellectually, we can trace this exact same arrogance back to astronomy, specifically the battle between geocentrism and heliocentrism.
Right, the center of the universe debate.
For over 1,000 years, the Ptolemaic system dominated human thought. It was an incredibly complex, mathematically dense, and internally consistent system built entirely on a single, flawed premise: the absolute belief that Earth, The rock where the observer happens to reside was the static center of the entire universe.
The Earth was the absolute one.
When Nicholas Copernicus proposed the heliocentric model, proving that the Earth revolves around the sun, the resistance wasn't just about theology or bad telescopes. It was a massive, traumatic psychological rupture.
It demanded the complete decentralization of humanity's ego.
Exactly. We had to admit that we were just on a rock orbiting a star in a vast emptiness. Ablecentrism, the worship of the normal human brain as the pinnacle of reality, is exactly the same cognitive trap as geocentrism or anthropocentrism. It simply swaps the coordinate axis from planetary bodies to cognitive ability.
And if we are decentralizing the ego, we have to bring in Jacques Derrida here. His concept of logocentrism seems like the ultimate tool to dismantle this one baseline.
Derrida is essential here. His philosophy of deconstruction focused heavily on how Western thought is entirely built on binary oppositions. Light versus dark, speech versus writing, male versus female, and crucially for us, normal versus abnormal.
And these binaries aren't equal, right?
Derrida pointed out that these binaries are never neutral. The first term is always arbitrarily privileged by society. It is viewed as pure, present, central, and original.
While the second term is defined exclusively as a lack, a derivative, a corrupted or contaminated version of the first.
Exactly. The source text utilizes Derrida to reveal that the privilege of the normal over the abnormal does not stem from any objective ontological fact in biology. It stems solely from the self-establishment of power. The center anchors the structure, but the center is completely arbitrary.
So if the center is arbitrary, then the concept of being substandard or below the baseline is essentially an empty insult. Without an objective origin point, your ruler is measuring absolutely nothing.
Precisely.
This leads me to Thomas Nagel's famous 1974 philosophical essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?
Oh, this is a great thought experiment.
Let's run it. Imagine a society where bats constitute the absolute majority. They hold the institutional power, they dictate the baseline of one. A bat's primary mode of navigating and perceiving the universe is echolocation high-frequency sonar.
Right.
Now imagine a human walking into bat society. Humans are completely blind in the pitch dark. We lack even a rudimentary capacity for echolocation. The bats would look at us as severely defective, hopelessly disabled 1-N creatures. To the bat, our heavy reliance on visible light, a spectrum that disappears for half the day, might seem like a bizarre, limited, and practically useless genetic mutation. In a bat society, humans would be the ones subjected to eugenics programs to cure our lack of sonar.
It is a humorous hypothetical, but it exposes a devastating truth. Once you strip away the anthropocentric filter, the arrogant assumption that human perception is the only valid perception, the entire illusion of the one collapses.
Right?
The ideology of eugenics is often portrayed by its defenders as cruel but biologically logical. The text proves that it is not logical at all. It is built on an incredibly fragile linguistic fallacy. It is a house of cards built on a category mistake.
But it is a house of cards equipped with a fully functioning meat grinder.
Yes.
And that realization brings us to the most chilling deduction in the entire text. The third layer.
The endgame.
We've established that the one is an illusion. But what happens to a society that builds its entire legal, moral, and economic order around aggressively enforcing this completely illusory standard? What kind of machine are they actually operating?
The text calls it a blind reverse elimination machine.
A blind reverse elimination machine.
This is the climax of the sociological argument. This layer completely shatters the fundamental promised myth of eugenics.
Which is what exactly?
Eugenics, social Darwinism, and extreme ableism all promise a utopian future. They preach that if we ruthlessly prune the bottom branches of the human tree, if we medically and socially eliminate the weak, the sick, and the 1-N, we will force human evolution.
We will eventually cultivate a purified race of supermen.
But the text mathematically proves that this operational goal is a paradox. It is utterly impossible.
I want to make sure I grasp the mechanics of why it's impossible. Walk me through the failure of the machine.
The machine fails because its cleansing algorithm is permanently locked at an upper limit of 1.
Okay.
We must return to our discussion of standpoint epistemology. Remember that the normal majority, the one, literally lacks the cognitive hardware to comprehend the 1+N superindividual.
Right, the PS4 trying to run the PS5 game.
Exactly. To the one, any deviation from the center looks like a threat. The 1+N looks just like the 1-N, abnormal, chaotic, incomprehensible, and dangerous.
So they conflate genius with madness again.
Therefore, a society that violently worships ability, as defined strictly by the center, actually transforms into an adverse selection machine.
Adverse selection. In economics, that means a market process that inadvertently selects against the very trait it is trying to encourage.
Precisely. Any true evolutionary mutation that transcends the existing system, a genuine 1+N cognitive or biological leap, fundamentally threatens the stability, the comfort, and the common sense of the one baseline.
So when the 1+N appears, the societal system's immune response triggers.
It views the genius, the visionary, the necessary evolutionary leap not as a savior, but as a pathogen. And it uses all of its institutional power to ruthlessly kill, silence, or marginalize its highest breakthrough elements.
The tragic irony is that it strangles its own supermen with its own hands, all while proudly, mistakenly believing it is clearing out the lowest defects.
It is not forced evolution. It is a mechanism of forced evolution.
It is a machine that blindly murders its own ceiling because it thinks it's looking at the floor. That is terrifying.
We need to spend some significant time detailing how society historically murders its 1+N elements, because history proves this thesis over and over again.
You mentioned the Semmelweis reflex earlier. That story needs to be told in full because it perfectly encapsulates the machine in action.
Ignaz Semmelweis is perhaps the quintessential tragic 1+N figure in the history of medicine. In the mid-19th century, he was a physician working in a maternity clinic in Vienna.
Okay.
He noticed a horrifying statistical anomaly. The mortality rate for mothers dying of childbed fever was drastically higher in the hospital wards where aristocratic doctors and medical students delivered babies compared to the wards where midwives delivered them.
Which is so counterintuitive.
He observed the daily routines and made a completely 1+N deductive leap. He realized that the doctors were performing autopsies on diseased corpses in the morgue in the morning and then walking directly up to the maternity ward to deliver babies in the afternoon, transmitting what he called cadaverous particles to the healthy mothers.
And we have to remember the context here. This is decades before Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch established the germ theory of disease. Nobody knew what a bacterium was.
Exactly. Semmelweis was seeing a reality that the medical establishment could not perceive. He instituted a mandatory policy that all doctors must scrub their hands with a chlorinated lime solution before touching patients.
And what happened?
The mortality rate plummeted instantly. It was a life-saving, paradigm-shifting 1+N discovery.
And what was the reaction of the medical establishment, the normal distribution majority of ones?
They rejected his findings with a furious, visceral hatred.
They didn't give him a medal. They destroyed him.
The idea offended their common sense. The doctors, who saw themselves as gentlemen of the absolute baseline, believed their hands were inherently clean because of their social status.
Wow.
They deemed Semmelweis's theory offensive and insane. They drove him out of the Vienna medical community. The relentless rejection, ridicule, and professional isolation drove him into a severe state of depression and mental breakdown.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
He was tricked into visiting a psychiatric asylum and was forcibly committed. When he tried to escape, he was severely beaten by the guards, and he died a few weeks later from a gangrenous wound.
So the medical community utilized the exact same institutional tools of marginalization meant for purging the 1-N to purge their greatest 1+N lifesaver.
The system activated its immune response against a cure. It protected the baseline at the cost of countless lives. And this pattern of the center destroying the apex echoes all the way back to antiquity.
Oh, for sure. Look at Socrates in ancient Athens.
A classic example.
He was the ultimate 1+N of philosophy. He utilized the Socratic method to relentlessly question the fundamental, unquestioned assumptions of the Athenian pulsus. He exposed the ignorance of the center.
And the Athenian establishment, the Sirwanons, couldn't handle the psychological instability his questioning caused.
So they put him on trial and executed him with hemlock, the official charges, corrupting the youth in impiety. They killed their greatest thinker because he made the baseline uncomfortable.
And look at Galileo Galilei.
Yeah.
He uses a telescope to gather empirical evidence proving the Copernican heliocentric model, a literal physical 1+N cosmic view. And the Roman Inquisition, acting as the ultimate enforcers of the absolute one baseline, forces him to recant his discoveries under the very real threat of torture and places him under house arrest for the remainder of his life.
There's a profound folk saying that perfectly encapsulates this adverse selection machine. The tallest tree in the forest is destroyed by the wind first, precisely because the height of the wind only understands the average height of the forest.
The wind cannot tolerate what it cannot reach.
We see this theory vividly corroborated in our greatest science fiction. which so often serves as a warning mirror for these sociological endgames. I am thinking of the film Gattaca.
Oh, Gattaca is perfect for this.
In the world of Gattaca, society has actually achieved the eugenic dream. Through genetic engineering, almost everyone is born flawless. They are optimized for intelligence, physical endurance, and disease resistance. They are mathematically perfect ones.
Right.
But the movie reveals that in achieving this perfection, they have completely scrubbed away all unquantified human passion, all irrational drive, all the volatile, unpredictable elements of the human spirit that historically lead to true greatness.
The society is stunningly beautiful, but entirely sterile and static.
Exactly. It cannot tolerate Vincent, a natural-born invalid who possesses the sheer irrational willpower to reach the stars. The system views his passion as a defect.
Aldous Huxley's Brave New World depicts this dynamic even more starkly and perhaps more accurately to our current trajectory. The society Huxley constructs is completely addicted to average, narcotized stability. Everyone is genetically tailored and chemically conditioned from birth to be perfectly content with their assigned, rigid role.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the one baseline, achieved through a drug called Soma.
But then the narrative introduces John the Savage, a man raised on a reservation outside the system. He reads Shakespeare. He feels deep, agonizing pain and soaring, euphoric love. He is a 1+N emotional and intellectual being.
And the society of ones completely fails to process him.
They treat him as an amusing freak show, an anomaly that must be studied but never assimilated. The friction between his 1+N soul and their deadened one baseline is so unbearable that John is ultimately driven to hang himself.
The society of ones passively destroys the 1+N because average stability is worshipped as the only absolute truth.
If we want to overlay some modern theoretical frameworks onto this historical and fictional pattern, Thomas Kuhn's landmark work on the philosophy of science is vital. In his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn pointed out that what he literally termed normal science, which represents the established, accepted one baseline of any scientific era, will violently and reflexively reject any paradigm shifts.
Any new theory that shatters the old framework is initially treated not as a discovery, but as heresy.
Furthermore, Nassim Nicholas Taleb's concept of the antifragile mathematically proves why this reverse elimination machine is doomed to long-term failure.
Break that down for us.
Taleb argues that a system that attempts to completely eliminate all volatility, meaning a society that attempts to purge both the +N and the -N to maintain an extremely smooth, perfectly average 1, actually becomes incredibly fragile.
How does removing stress make it fragile?
By removing all the stress and variation, it loses the mutational diversity required to adapt to unknown catastrophic external shocks. By trying to make itself mathematically perfect, society makes itself brittle, setting the stage for total systemic collapse.
Let me make sure I'm synthesizing this. We are trapped inside a self-devouring meat grinder that actively assassinates its own evolutionary potential while congratulating itself for maintaining good hygiene.
That is the bleak reality of it.
That's a horrifying realization.
Yeah.
But it leads us to the final and frankly most existentially terrifying question of this entire deep dive, the ultimate hit from a God's eye view.
Here we go.
If there is no objective one, and we're just blindly chopping off the top and the bottom of our population to fit our own arbitrary, culturally defined ruler, is there any possible way to know where humanity actually stands in the grand cosmic scheme of things?
The short answer is no, and the longer philosophical answer is a devastating logical closed loop. Because there is no objective one, humanity can never mathematically prove that it isn't actually a deeply flawed 1-N operating in some higher coordinate system that we simply cannot perceive.
I want to zoom the perspective all the way out here. Out past human history, out past sociological models, all the way to the scale of cosmic evolution. If we sit here on Earth and play this game of eliminating the weak, if we legally or morally justify the slaughter or marginalization of the 1-N, because we arrogant humans believe we are the absolute peak of biological existence, what happens when a bigger player enters the game?
We invite our own total destruction.
Exactly.
The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood this evolutionary transition deeply. He famously wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "Man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss."
He understood that current Homo sapiens are merely an intermediate node, a messy transitional phase in the incredibly long river of biological and cosmic evolution.
For current humanity to arrogantly declare itself the absolute peak, the ultimate and final one, is an act of supreme evolutionary short-sightedness. If we endorse the logic of exterminating the 1 minus n based on cognitive or physical ability, we scientifically and philosophically write the moral blank check for an advanced alien civilization to exterminate us.
Because to a hyper-advanced species, relative to their 1 plus n scale, we are the developmentally stunted, violent, primitive 1 minus n. I want to run some specific scenarios to really ground this concept of cosmic short-sightedness, because it is staggering when you think about it. Let's look back before we look forward. Think about the Neanderthals.
Okay.
Let's imagine a hypothetical Neanderthal counterkill. Neanderthals were physically much stronger, heavily muscled, and more robustly adapted to the cold than early Homo sapiens.
Right, they were the physical baseline.
If Neanderthals had developed a primitive physical eugenics philosophy, they might have considered their powerful, robust physical form to be the perfect one. They might have looked at the scrawny, physically weaker early Homo sapiens, who were actually a 1 plus n cognitive mutation, developing more complex social structures and advanced frontal lobes as defective, useless 1 minus n runts.
That's a great point.
If the Neanderthals had possessed the organization to use eugenics to wipe out early humans to purify the hominid line, the entire history of human civilization, all of our art and science, would have died in the crib. The stronger, average species would have murdered the smarter mutant species in the name of optimizing the population.
A brilliant evolutionary hypothetical that perfectly captures the danger. And if we look to contemporary hard science fiction, Lou Sixon's masterpiece, The Three-Body Problem, explores this exact cosmic vulnerability through the dark forest theory.
Oh, the dark forest is terrifying.
In that universe, the cosmos is populated by highly advanced, godlike civilizations, such as the Singer civilization. To the Singer, humanity isn't even a 1 minus n. We are literally a bug on a windshield. We are dust.
All of human art, our grand history, our dense philosophy, the entire one baseline that we pride ourselves on, is utterly meaningless and imperceptible to them.
Exactly. When the Singer civilization decides to cleanse a solar system by deploying a dual-vector foil, a weapon that literally collapses 3D space into 2D space, a dimensionality reduction strike, they don't do it out of malice or hatred. They do it out of casual bureaucratic hygiene.
The terrifying logical conclusion here is this. If humans endorse an ability-based cleansing of the right to survive on Earth, we have absolutely no philosophical or moral grounds to complain when a superior cosmic civilization steps on us like ants.
We have already validated the logic of our own extermination. That is the inevitable, inescapable extension of ability worship.
We validate our own extermination by building the weapon ourselves. Another scenario that brings this God's eye view home is the simulation hypothesis, which most people know is the core concept of the film The Matrix.
Oh, definitely.
In The Matrix, billions of humans live inside a simulated reality. They go to work, they pay taxes, they fall in love, and they absolutely believe they are living in the normal, objective one reality.
But they are completely oblivious to the fact that to the machine civilization that actually runs the simulation in the real world, humans are nothing more than copper-top batteries.
In the machine's coordinate system, we aren't even 1 minus n. We are just a raw chemical resource to be harvested.
That maps perfectly onto modern technological philosophy. Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis warns us of this very possibility using probability theory. He argues that given the rate of technological advancement, it is highly probable that the current cognitive state of humanity is merely a very low-level phase, perhaps a historical simulation run by vastly superior post-humans.
Transhumanist philosophy echoes this warning.
Proclaiming the end of history, or deciding that the current flawed human form is the absolute biological perfection that must be protected and purified from any deviation, is the common, fatal malady of all totalitarian systems.
By attempting to enforce this rigid one, by trying to purify the gene pool based on our incredibly limited, phenomenally ignorant perspective of the universe, we permanently destroy our potential to evolve into the unknown.
We lock the evolutionary door from the inside and throw away the key.
Wow. I need a moment to process the sheer weight of this. We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
Let's try to synthesize this epic three-layer journey we've just been on, to bring it all back together for you listening. We started at the surface layer. The bloody, historically verified history of eugenics, the pseudoscience of social Darwinism, the chilling legal precedent of Buck v. Bell, and the bureaucratic nightmare of Nazi Action T4.
We looked at humanity's attempt to industrialize human worth based entirely on biological and economic ledgers.
From there, we excavated the middle layer. We explored the philosophical revelation that this entire history of bloodshed is based on a massive category mistake.
The error of treating normal as the center of the universe, taking a completely relative indexical concept, like the statistical one, and pretending it is an objective eternal truth.
We saw how this ablecentrism is identical in its arrogance to the geocentric model of the universe or the spatial distortion of the Mercator projection.
And finally, we plummeted to the bottom layer. The terrifying mathematical revelation that any society actively enforcing this illusion of normalcy is not actually building a utopia.
It is operating a blind, reverse elimination meat grinder, an adverse selection machine that actively assassinates its own geniuses, its own 1+n evolutionary leaps, simply because it mistakes their brilliance for anomalies.
All while the society remains completely cosmically blind to the fact that it might actually be the 1-n to some higher cosmic order.
The core actionable takeaway for you, the listener, is that the journey we went on today is not just an abstract history lesson about the 1920s or the 1940s.
No, the cognitive limitation we mapped out is a permanent trap built into the hardware of the human mind.
You must be acutely aware of this trap when you judge what is normal in your own life, in your daily workplace, or in your broader society.
When you encounter someone who doesn't fit the mold, whether they seem deficient, eccentric, or incomprehensibly strange, you must remember the Procrustean bed.
You must recognize that the logic of extreme optimization and enforcing the center is ultimately a collective suicide cloaked in the garments of evolution.
Collective suicide cloaked in the garments of evolution. That is a heavy, necessary truth to swallow.
And it leads me to one final lingering thought for you to ponder as we wrap up. It is something that wasn't directly answered in the text, but that builds on every single layer we've just discussed.
What's that?
As we stand here today, entering the dawn of CRISPR and advanced genetic engineering, we are, for the very first time in human history, gaining the actual technological power to artificially program the human one.
We can edit the source code?
Exactly. If our current society is indeed an adverse selection machine, a system terrified of the unknown and obsessed with conformity, what are we going to do with this unprecedented power?
That's the ultimate question.
Will we use this godlike technology to create a beautiful, unpredictable, diverse spectrum of new human potential? Or will we use it to build the ultimate, inescapable Procrustean bed, permanently deleting the possibility of the 1+n superhuman forever?
Think about that the next time someone tries to tell you what's normal.
Thank you so much for joining us on this profound deep dive. Stay curious and keep questioning the baseline.